There are heroes history gives us, and there are heroes history manufactures. Leonidas was both. The man who saved Greece and the man who ran Greece's most efficient murder program walked in the same armor, carried the same spear, and smiled the same cold smile. This is the story of both of them. 300 men stood against 1,000,000. One king became immortal. But here is what they do not tell you. The hero of Thermopylae was also the enforcer of history's most brutal state-sanctioned killing system. And the 300 were not the only ones who died at his command. Every year, Leonidas oversaw the ritual murder of thousands of innocent people. Not Persians, Greeks. Greece's own enslaved population, slaughtered annually as a matter of policy. The very survival of Western civilization supposedly rested on this man's shoulders. But what if the cure was worse than the disease? 300 versus 1,000,000, except the real numbers tell a different story. Here is the darker math no one mentions. 7 helots murdered for every 1 Spartan citizen, every single year. That is not war, that is systematic extermination. By the end of this video, you will understand why the real Leonidas was simultaneously Greece's greatest hero and its most efficient monster. And you will understand why the 2,100 slaves who died beside the 300 were erased from every record, every monument, and every movie ever made about this battle. The story you know is a lie. Not because the 300 did not fight, they did. Not because they did not die, they did. But because the story was designed by the man who died in it. Designed to hide the bodies he buried beneath the legend. Designed to make you admire the killer and forget the killed. Sparta was not a city-state. It was a prison camp masquerading as a civilization. By 490 BC, this military machine ran on a simple, terrifying equation: complete dominance through complete brutality. But Sparta's greatest enemy was not Persia. It was the 250,000 human beings they kept in chains. The helots were not foreign captives. They were Greeks, descendants of the original inhabitants of the land Sparta had conquered, reduced to agricultural slaves who worked the fields that fed the warriors who enslaved them. 7 helots for every 1 Spartan citizen. That ratio tells you everything about why Sparta needed to be so brutal. They were not warriors by choice. They were warriors because if they stopped for a single generation, the people they had enslaved would rise and tear them apart. Every autumn, Sparta declared war on its own population. Not metaphorical war, actual legal war. The ephors, the 5 elected magistrates who wielded the real power, formally announced hostilities against the helots. This meant any Spartan could kill any helot without legal consequence. A teenager could drive a spear through a farmer's chest on a public road in broad daylight and face no punishment. They called it maintaining order. We call it state terrorism. And the terror was not occasional. It was structural. It was the foundation on which every Spartan institution was built. The Agoge existed because Sparta needed killers. Sparta needed killers because it needed to control a population 7 times its size. And it needed to control that population because without helot labor, Spartan citizens could not spend their entire lives training for war. The whole system was a circle of violence. Helots fed Spartans. Spartans terrorized helots. Terror kept helots working. Work kept Spartans free to train. Training produced warriors who terrorized helots. Remove any single element and the entire civilization collapses. That is why Sparta could not afford mercy. Mercy was not a moral failure. It was an existential threat. The system that held this together was designed with terrifying precision. 2 kings ruled simultaneously, a system meant to prevent tyranny that instead created double the oppression. The Gerousia, 28 elders over 60, decided who lived and who died, including which newborn infants were strong enough to be raised and which would be left on the slopes of Mount Taygetos to die of exposure. Modern archaeological evidence from Spartan sites confirms what ancient sources claimed. Mass graves of children's bones showing signs of fatal trauma. The culling began at birth. And binding it all together, the Agoge, the training system that turned boys into weapons and weapons into men who had forgotten they were ever boys. Leonidas's wife Gorgo was his niece. She was also the only woman in Sparta permitted to speak in the assembly. She was forged from the same iron as her husband. When a visiting Athenian woman asked her why Spartan women were the only women who could rule men, Gorgo answered, "Because we are the only women who give birth to men." That answer tells you everything about the world Leonidas came from. A world where strength was the only currency and mercy was the only weakness. A world that produced the finest warriors the ancient world had ever seen, and the most systematic murderers. The Agoge did not create soldiers, it manufactured killers. And the difference between a soldier and a killer is that a soldier fights enemies. A killer fights whoever he is told to. When 7-year-old Leonidas was torn from his mother's arms in 520 BC, he entered a system designed to destroy everything weak, everything compassionate, everything human inside him. What the state gave back 23 years later was not human anymore. It was something else. Something Sparta had spent centuries perfecting. Boys slept naked on reed beds they gathered themselves from the riverbanks with their bare hands. Food was deliberately kept insufficient, forcing them to steal or starve. But the punishment for theft was not for stealing. It was for getting caught. One boy, legend says, let a stolen fox gnaw through his stomach rather than reveal his crime. He died standing upright, with his intestines in his hands, and Sparta called him a hero. They called this education. Modern psychologists have another word: systematic torture designed to destroy empathy and replace it with obedience. At age 12, each boy received a mentor, an adult warrior who would shape his development through methods that no civilized society would tolerate. Then came the Crypteia. At 18, the most promising killers were selected for the final test. They were sent into the countryside with nothing but a dagger and a single order: kill helots, any helots. The strongest ones were preferred, the ones who looked like they might lead a rebellion, the ones who stood too tall, or spoke too clearly, or had too much pride left in their eyes after a lifetime of servitude. The teenagers were sent out at dusk. They hid in ditches along roads where helots walked. They waited in barns where helot families slept. What does it do to a teenager's mind to lie in the dark waiting to kill a man who has done nothing to him? The Agoge had already answered that question. It does exactly what Sparta intended. It removes the part of the brain that asks why. They killed in silence and returned before dawn. The best Crypteia graduates killed without being seen by anyone at all. A farmer who was there at sunset was not there at sunrise. No body found, no questions asked. Leonidas excelled. His instructors noted his particular efficiency, his ability to disconnect from the act of killing. When he returned from his Crypteia year with 17 confirmed kills, above average for his cohort, they knew they had created something special, something monstrous. Think about what kind of society praises a teenager for his ability to murder without feeling. That is the society that produced the hero of Thermopylae. In 490 BC, King Cleomenes, Leonidas's half-brother, died under mysterious circumstances, found in prison, supposedly a suicide, though the wounds suggested otherwise. Leonidas, the third son who should never have ruled, suddenly ascended to the throne. His first act as king was to intensify the Agoge. His reasoning was simple: Persia grows strong, Sparta must grow harder. The selection of the 300 began years before Thermopylae. Leonidas did not want the best warriors. He wanted men with living sons, men whose bloodlines would survive their deaths. The choice was not about who could fight, it was about who could afford to die. But hidden in the selection was an even more chilling truth. Each Spartan would bring 7 helots as support troops, 300 times 7. 2,100 enslaved humans marching to certain death. Their names were erased from every record. Their deaths would be erased from every story. Their existence would be erased from every monument built to honor the 300 men they served. That was not an accident. That was the plan. And so, with the dead already chosen and the story already written, the march began. The march to Thermopylae began with a lie. Leonidas told the ephors he was leading a sacred guard to the Carneia festival. In reality, he was marching 300 Spartans and 2,100 helots towards certain death. The lie was the first weapon he deployed. Day 1 covered 70 miles. The Spartans sang paeans, war hymns that echoed off mountain walls. Behind them, silent and loaded like pack animals, the helots carried the real weight. Spare shields, replacement spears, food for warriors who saw them as expendable equipment. 6,700 other Greeks joined them along the way. Thespians, Thebans, Corinthians, Arcadians. History forgot their names because Sparta wrote the story. These were not just allies. They were the witnesses Leonidas would need to manage. Dead men do not argue with the living about what happened. The Hot Gates earned their name from sulfur springs that reeked of the underworld. The pass at its narrowest spanned 50 feet, wide enough for maybe 8 men standing shoulder to shoulder. Mountains rose on one side. Cliffs dropped to the sea on the other. Leonidas walked the ground like a man selecting his own grave. The oracle at Delphi had whispered a prophecy that hung over the march like a shadow. Either Sparta would fall, or a Spartan king would die. The words left no room for victory without cost. Leonidas had already made his choice. He had made it before he left Sparta. He had made it before the march began. He had made it the moment the oracle spoke. When the Persian threat had been growing since Darius's defeat at Marathon, when Xerxes inherited the throne, along with his father's humiliation, when reports reached Sparta that the largest army in human history was mobilizing, Leonidas did not prepare for defense. He prepared for sacrifice. And sacrifice requires victims. The only question left was how many people he would take with him, and which of those people would be remembered afterward. The psychological warfare began before the first spear was thrown. Persian scouts rode forward to observe the Greek positions. What they found confused them. The Spartans were not in formation. They were exercising naked, combing their long hair in the morning sun as if preparing for a festival instead of a battle. A Persian officer asked a local Greek exile what this meant. The exile answered that when Spartans comb their hair, they are preparing to die. And when Spartans prepare to die, the men facing them should prepare as well. The Persians did not understand. They would understand within the hour. A captured scout was brought before Leonidas and released with a message. "Tell Xerxes the sons of Heracles await." Xerxes sent envoys offering terms. "Submit. Keep your lands. Become friends of the Persian Empire. Reasonable by any standard." Leonidas's response was not reasonable. He had the messengers watch as Spartans executed a group of helots for alleged cowardice, a demonstration of Spartan justice performed for an audience. The message was clear. "We are not reasonable men." Day 1. Xerxes sent his Median troops first, expendable forces to test Spartan resolve. The phalanx moved like a single organism, shields locked, spears creating a hedge of death 8 feet beyond the shield wall. In 15 minutes, 500 Medians lay dying in the dust. The Spartan rotation system was mechanical genius. Every 15 minutes, fresh warriors rotated to the front, while exhausted men stepped back to rest. But look closer at what the rotation concealed. Helots dragged away the wounded. Helots held the flanks. Helots died in droves in positions deliberately chosen to absorb missile fire. For every Spartan that fell, 7 Helots perished. Their deaths were not recorded. Their names were not spoken. They were equipment. And equipment does not get eulogies. The ground became mud. not from rain, from blood. The narrow pass concentrated the killing into a space where bodies piled so high they formed barriers. Persians could not retrieve their dead without entering the killing zone. Disease threatened from the first afternoon. The sulfur springs mixed with the smell of opened bodies created a stench that made hardened warriors retch. Then came the immortals, 10,000 of Persia's finest, scale armor glittering like serpent skin, a reputation that had conquered cities without a blade being drawn. But the immortals had never faced the Agoge's graduates. Here is the part no historian wants to admit. It was not courage that made Spartans superior. It was programming. Where Persians fought to live, Spartans had been taught to die. A man who fears death hesitates. A man who welcomes death does not. And in combat, hesitation is measured in the distance between a spear point and a throat. The phalanx pushed forward, a bronze glacier grinding everything in its path. The killing became mechanical. Thrust, twist, withdraw, step forward over the corpse, repeat. Spears broke and were replaced instantly by helot runners who sprinted through fire to deliver fresh weapons. When shields splintered, new ones appeared. The support system was invisible but essential, and entirely expendable. The Spartans used a technique the Persians had never encountered, the feigned retreat. The phalanx would appear to break, pulling back in apparent disorder. Persian troops, sensing victory, would surge forward into the narrowest point of the pass. Then, at a signal, the Spartans would wheel with parade ground precision and drive back into the compressed mass. The funnel became an abattoir. Day 2 dawned on a charnel house. The night between had offered no relief. Persians had attempted infiltration in darkness. The Spartans, their bronze coated with mud to kill reflection, had butchered them in the dark. Men killed by warriors who had trained blindfolded since age 10. Dorieus, Leonidas's own brother, took an arrow through the eye slit of his helmet and fell. Leonidas showed no emotion. The Agoge had burned such weakness away. But the other Greeks saw something that changed everything. Spartans could die. Alpheus and Maron, sons of the same family, died within minutes of each other. The Thespians, fighting alongside, began to grasp the mathematics. At this rate, they had hours, not days. As afternoon sun blazed on the second day, Xerxes deployed psychological warfare alongside steel. Musicians played to tire the mind. Incense burned to mask the stench of death. Fresh troops rotated in continuously while the same Spartans held the line. This is where Leonidas's selection criteria proved its dark genius. These men had trained together since childhood. Their bodies bore the scars of the Agoge on 40% of their skin. Deliberately broken and reset bones had created denser skeletal structures. Their pain tolerance exceeded normal human limits. Leonidas himself carried a scar from right eyebrow to left jaw, a training accident that nearly cost him an eye. In Sparta, scars were not disfigurement. They were credentials. These men could fight blind, knowing exactly where their brothers stood. They could rotate positions without verbal commands. They were not an army. They were a single weapon with 300 edges. But even the finest weapon dulls. By dusk of the second day, the mathematics were closing in. Then came the betrayal everyone expected. Ephialtes, a local Greek, sold the mountain path to Xerxes for gold. Persian forces began moving through the Anopeia path to encircle the defenders. Archaeological evidence suggests Leonidas knew about this path all along. Stone markers clearly Spartan have been found along the route. The betrayal may have been anticipated, perhaps even encouraged, because encirclement served Leonidas's purpose. It made retreat impossible, and impossible retreat made legend inevitable. Any competent commander would withdraw, save the army, fight another day. Leonidas had hours before the trap closed. He could save every man under his command. Instead, he smiled. That cold expression the Agoge perfected in boys who had learned to kill without feeling. because retreat would save lives, but it would not create a legend. And Leonidas understood something about legend that no Persian general ever grasped. A king who retreats is forgotten by the next generation. A king who dies holding a pass against impossible odds is remembered forever. The sacrifice was not about saving Greece. Greece could be saved by the fleet at Salamis, by the army at Plataea. The sacrifice was about ensuring that Sparta's version of events, Sparta's myth, Sparta's propaganda, would be the version that survived. And for a myth to be unquestionable, the people who might question it needed to be dead. He sent the allied Greek forces away. Tell them Sparta held. They thought it was mercy. It was narrative control. The allies who left would carry Sparta's version home. The allies who stayed would carry nothing, because the dead do not dispute the version of events the living choose to tell. He kept 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians who volunteered, 400 Thebans held against their will as suspected Persian sympathizers, and 2,100 Helots. The selection of who stayed and who left was not about honor, it was about controlling the story. Dawn on the third day came with Persian trumpets from 3 directions. The immortals had circled through the mountains. The main force pressed the front. Encirclement was complete. The Spartans abandoned the defensive wall and advanced into open ground, not to defend, to kill as many as possible before dying. This is the part of the story that creates heroes, and this is where the story hides its darkest truth. As the battle became hopeless, Leonidas ordered something unthinkable. The Helots who had served so faithfully, who had carried the shields and the spears and the water, who had held the flanks and absorbed the arrows and died in numbers that dwarfed Spartan losses, were to be killed. Not by Persians, by Spartans. No witnesses, no slaves returning to Sparta to speak of what they had seen. No voices to contradict the story that would be told. The 2,100 Helots who had carried the shields and the spears and the water and the food were to be killed. The men who had held the flanks while Spartan warriors rotated to safety, who had died in numbers that no chronicle recorded, were silenced permanently. Not by the enemy they had fought beside, by the masters they had served. The Thebans, trying to surrender, were cut down by their supposed allies. 400 men, killed not by Persians but by Greeks, their crime being that they might survive to tell a version of events that did not match the one Sparta intended to sell. The final phase became the legend we know. Leonidas fell early, his body becoming a rallying point. Persians and Spartans fought over his corpse. When spears broke, they fought with swords. When swords broke, with hands and teeth. Leonidas, the wit, died still making jokes. Earlier he had been told that Persian arrows would blot out the sun. Good, he had replied. Then we shall have our battle in the shade. He died in the shade of 10,000 arrows with that same cold humor on his lips. The final group made their stand on a small hill. Xerxes, perhaps sickened by his own casualties, ordered his archers to finish it. The sky went dark with arrows. The last Spartan standing was found with over 40 arrows in his shield, still upright in death. The final stand was not a battle. It was orchestrated mass suicide, designed to create a legend. And the legend required that certain people die and certain people be erased. The 300 would be remembered. The 2,100 would not. That was the plan. That was always the plan. As Leonidas fell, pierced by arrows, he smiled, because death was just the beginning of his plan. The plan was immortality. And immortality required silence from everyone who might tell a different version of the story. Xerxes ordered a body count. Persian dead between 15,000 and 20,000, including 2 of the king's own brothers. Greek dead, approximately 4,000. But the proportions reveal the darkness. Of 300 Spartans, 298 died. 2 had been sent away as messengers. Of 700 Thespians, none survived. Of 400 Thebans, none survived. Of 2,100 Helots, the records go suspiciously silent. 2 Spartans survived, and their fate reveals Sparta's true nature. Aristodemus, sent away with an eye infection, returned to Sparta in shame. Despite fighting heroically a year later at Plataea, deliberately seeking death in battle, he was never forgiven. Pantites, sent as a messenger, hanged himself rather than face Spartan contempt. Survival was the only unforgivable sin. The cover-up began immediately. The 2 surviving messengers spread a carefully crafted narrative. 300 Spartans against 1,000,000 Persians. No mention of allies until pressed. No mention of helots ever. Within a generation, 7,000 defenders became 300. Herodotus, writing just 50 years later, already reported the legend over the facts. By the time Plutarch wrote, Thermopylae had become pure propaganda, a story about freedom, defended by history's least free society. The version became the only version, because the people who could have told a different story were dead. Modern archaeological evidence from the battle site tells what the myths will not. Mass graves were found, but they were separated by class. Even in death, Spartan remains, identified by their bronze, were buried with honors. Surrounding them in unmarked pits, thousands of skeletons showing signs of violence. Not all from Persian weapons. Some wounds match Spartan spear patterns. The killing of witnesses had been thorough. The 700 Thespians who died, their city was too small to dispute Sparta's version. The 400 Thebans, branded as traitors who tried to surrender, their reputation destroyed for centuries. The other Greeks who fought earlier, edited from the story entirely. And the 2,100 Helots, they simply vanished from history, exactly as Leonidas intended. What happened to Leonidas's body violated every rule of ancient warfare. Xerxes, in rage over his catastrophic losses, ordered the body crucified and beheaded, sacrilege by both Greek and Persian standards. But the mutilation served Leonidas's purpose better than a proper burial ever could. It transformed a military defeat into a martyrdom. The headless king became more powerful than the living one had ever been. Within a year, Greek forces would crush Xerxes at Salamis and Plataea. The sacrifice had worked, not the sacrifice of the 300, the sacrifice of the 4,000. And none of them had been asked if they wanted to be martyrs. The Crypteia deserves its full accounting. Each year, Sparta declared war on its Helot population. Not a metaphor. Legal authorization for murder. Young Spartans would hunt human beings for sport, targeting the strongest, the smartest, anyone who might lead resistance. Conservative estimates suggest 2,000 Helot deaths annually from the Crypteia alone. Across Sparta's centuries of dominance, that is systematic murder on a scale that approaches genocide. Generation after generation of teenagers sent into the countryside with knives. Generation after generation of farmers who disappeared between sunset and sunrise. The Crypteia was not a secret. It was policy. And Leonidas, the hero, the lion, the defender of Greece, had been one of its most efficient practitioners before he was 20 years old. And here is the historical irony that should change how you think about everything you have just heard. Sparta's brutal system ultimately destroyed it. By 371 BC, barely a century after Thermopylae, Spartan military dominance was broken forever at the Battle of Leuctra. The reason was simple and devastating. They had killed too many of their own people. The Spartan citizen population had shrunk to unsustainable levels. The Helots they had terrorized for centuries finally broke free. The city that lived by the spear literally died by it. The ultimate irony of Thermopylae is that the system Leonidas died to protect, the system of Helot slavery and citizen warfare and child brutalization, destroyed itself within a century of his death. The 300 died to preserve a civilization that was already eating itself. Their sacrifice bought Sparta another 100 years, And Sparta used those 100 years to continue doing exactly what it had always done, terrorizing its own people until there were not enough of its own people left to terrorize anyone. But the myth outlived the reality by 25 centuries and counting. Romans admired Spartan discipline. Renaissance thinkers praised their sacrifice. Modern armies study Thermopylae as a heroic last stand. Films glorify the 300, while forgetting the 6,700, especially the 2,100 enslaved humans who died unnamed and unremembered. We have transformed a slave society's enforcers into freedom's champions. Consider what we celebrate when we honor the 300. These were not freedom fighters. They were the enforcement arm of a totalitarian state that had never believed in freedom for a single day of its existence. Sparta had no art, no philosophy, no culture beyond war. While Athens built the Parthenon, Sparta built nothing but soldiers. While Socrates questioned everything, Spartans only obeyed. The defenders of Western civilization represented its darkest possible path. The real lesson of Thermopylae is not about courage or sacrifice. It is about how history gets written by the survivors, how propaganda becomes truth, how we mistake brutality for strength, how a society that institutionalized child abuse, that murdered its enslaved population annually, that saw compassion as weakness, can be repackaged across 25 centuries as the defenders of everything we claim to value. If Leonidas returned today, what would he recognize? Not democracy, which Sparta despised, not individual freedom, which Sparta crushed, not mercy, which Sparta called weakness. He would recognize only one thing: the willingness to sacrifice lesser people for greater causes, the strong crushing the weak and calling it virtue. He would feel at home, and that should disturb us more than any Persian army ever could. Go back to the beginning. 300 men stood against an empire. One king became immortal, but those 300 men stood on the bones of thousands more. 2,100 helots who carried their shields and died without names. 700 Thespians whose sacrifice was stolen by Sparta's propaganda. 400 Thebans murdered by their supposed allies. We built a civilization on the story of 300 men who died for freedom. We forgot that those 300 men came from a society that had never believed in freedom for a single day of its existence. The lion's son was exactly what Sparta made him: a perfect killer who died perfectly, ensuring his victims' silence. History gave him a monument. The 2,100 got unmarked graves. That is not a tragedy. That is a plan. And the plan worked for 2,500 years. Some monsters wear lion skins. Some monsters become heroes. And sometimes 2,500 years is not long enough to wash the blood away. 300 Spartans and 20,000 forgotten dead. That is the real mathematics of Thermopylae. That is the real legacy of Leonidas.